Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the best year of your life. I'm April Seifert, and I'm here with WillaBlytheBaker. She is a longtime follower and authorized teacher of Tibetan Buddhism and a Lama. Willa is the founder and spiritual director of Natural Dharma Fellowship in Boston, Massachusetts, and its retreat center, Wonderwell Mountain Refuge in Springfield, New Hampshire. She's the author of several books: Essence of Ambrosia, Everyday Dharma, The Arts of Contemplative Care, and most recently, The Wakeful Body. Willa, I'm so grateful to have you here with us today.
So great to be here, April. And hello, everyone. Nice to see you all out there, too.
You know, I want to start with something very fundamental. I would love, just given your background and given the amount that you have spent studying and thinking about this topic, I would love to understand what spirituality means to you.
Spirituality, to me, is really about developing intimacy with yourself, others, and the world. And when I say a word like intimacy, what I mean is learning to turn the gaze inwards and to pilgrimage into your inner landscape. That is spirituality. And there are so many different ways to do that, right? So many ways to explore the life of consciousness within. And I see all of the spectrum of contemplative practices and religion as essentially taking us to that endpoint of becoming intimate with oneself and others. And along the lines of intimacy with others, spirituality is about integrating wisdom with compassion. And whatever kind of spirituality it is, I feel that's the end goal, to bring together a deepening wisdom and deepening compassion for others and also for our planet and beings on it.
I love that definition and I love that explanation. You know, throughout the summit, we've spoken with a number of experts in so many different fields, but through that broad definition and that meaningful definition, you can start to see how some of the things we're going to talk about today connect to these other aspects that we've been talking about. So I love the definition that you gave because it's deeper and more meaningful than what we would typically think about when we think about the word spirituality. You know, one of your core teachings involves connecting to the wisdom in our own bodies. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes. We often think of the body, I mean, in our culture, in Western culture, right? How we grow up in our society, we tend to think of the body as just this material thing, and we're mainly introduced to it in school through a medical model, right? The body as this functioning instrument that works on our behalf. And those visions of the body are pretty utilitarian, and they're pretty material. But actually, there's another body, we could say, beyond the body that we conceive of as just this flesh and blood body. The body that we conceive of as the flesh and blood body is one layer of who we are. But there are other layers of our embodied experience that we can begin to access when we turn the gaze within, through practices of slowing down and contemplating not the way we think about the body so much, but how we actually experience the body from moment to moment. And so what am I talking about when I say experience the body from moment to moment? I mean, we have a lot of ideas about body. I might think my body is unattractive, or my body is thin, or my body is thick, or my body is I'm tall, or I'm short. All of those are relative concepts about our body. But if we just in the present moment come down with our attention from the swirling thinking mind into just what we're feeling right now in the body, there's something very stable and steady about that experience. So if you come down right now, we can even do this right now as we're all together here, come down, closing our eyes from the headspace with its swirling thoughts, and descend down to the place where our body encounters the chair, or our feet are on the floor. You can feel that this body is stable, it is grounded, it is steady on the earth. You can feel that. And if you bring your attention into contact with that feeling teaches this flighty mind how to be grounded and present. So that's just a mini practice. That's a mini practice to help you access one of the body's wisdoms. There's so many. I write about them in The Wakeful Body, which is this new book. But essentially, our body is vibrating with wisdoms like that we are grounded. And just by bringing attention to the body, we can ground our mind, which is usually running all over the place into the past and the future.
I love that practice, especially because as a psychologist myself, we find that a lot of the suffering that people experience in life has to do with being so close and connected with that ongoing chatter, that fast-paced, relentless, it seems like, voice in our mind. We forget that there's more below the surface, neck down, there's more there to experience. We stay solely in our mind, and we don't connect in the way that you mentioned in order to simply balance out the way that we're thinking. And I love that practice. It's so simple, but so powerful.
Yeah, and relating to what you're saying, April, yes, right. We are so caught in the conceptual world, and we are taught. This is understandable, because we're taught from the time we're very young that it is our intelligence and our mind that is going to help us succeed. So when we hear messages like it's your mind that is going to help you succeed, and you want to get a good education and be intelligent, we tend to begin to believe, and I don't know, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but maybe you have this too, have experienced this too, that that's who we are. And actually, there's a lot more to our moment by moment experience than what we think. And in fact, when we start to turn our attention to that other parts of the self, the non-conceptual side of the mind, for example, the mind isn't just thinking. The mind is also openness and space. Or when we start to turn our attention to the body, we discover that or to our senses, what we're smelling, what we're hearing in the present moment, what we're feeling of the air on our skin. Suddenly, we're having a totally different experience than thinking. We're even experiencing something that isn't thinking, but is still awake, profound, and very real. Yeah. Or the emotions, right? The emotions aren't necessarily only the thinking, right? The emotions are something very visceral that we feel in our energy. And that too is a whole world of exploration, as you know, as a psychologist. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about just the benefits of the practice, that just the one practice that you mentioned around take emotions as a great example. The basis for what we would call emotional intelligence, one of the most basic fundamental pieces of that is recognizing your own emotions. And we can't do that unless we are literally feeling what's happening in our bodies. There's so much that we don't have access to if we aren't paying attention and grounding ourselves in the way that you just mentioned.
In the Buddhist tradition, there is this concept relating to what you were saying of a subtle body, which is a layer of embodiment that is coexisting with the physical. And the subtle body is, I would say, our first person experience of the nervous system, really. This sense of that our body is vibrating with energy from our head to our toes. And as we start to notice that our body is vibrating with this energy, we also notice when the energy shifts or changes. And that's where emotions live, right? When our emotions change, it's a feeling, just like you're saying. It's an actual like a rush of energy. For example, the most obvious one of the most obvious, most visceral emotions, right, is anger or rage, right? It's like almost like a fire that rises up through the torso and up to the head. We get flushed. We feel our heart pounding. It's so visceral, like you're describing. And if we're not tuned in to that subtle body or to the energetic side of our being, we may miss that the emotion is happening at all. And then what comes from that is suppression, avoidance, strategies of escape. And we don't really lean in to what's happening and discover what's really going on here in the emotion. April, I'm wondering what you, can I ask you a question back?
Yeah, go for it. I love it. Go for it.
How do you, one of the things that I've been working with lately in both in the teachings on the body and the subtle body and emotion and how these things manifest, from what I understand, the current neuroscience and just has demonstrated that we often feel emotion in the body before we even start to think. So that the thoughts don't necessarily come first, right? That someone is out to harm me doesn't come first. First, the body responds, and then the mind makes the story up on top of that. Have you heard that before?
Yes. Yeah. And It's interesting because you can see that in exactly what you mentioned around anger, fear, and excitement look very similar in the body. They involve elevated heart rate. They involve maybe a dilation of our pupils. They involve palms that sweat. They involve flushing of our skin. But we have these incredible minds that can pick up on context. And if I'm riding a roller coaster, I may not be angry, but depending on who I am, I might be afraid or excited. If I'm in a conversation with someone I don't agree with, I may not be excited. I might be angry or afraid. So we sift through using contextual cues. Okay, what must this mean in my body? But the body responds first.
That's very cool. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing. You mentioned something that is just one of my favorite topics these days. And so I'm going to be indulgent and go there. You teach about, and you hinted at this notion of the non-dual nature of our sense of self. And this can be, admittedly, a really tough concept to grasp. So can you give us just an overview of what non-duality is and what we know of it now?
So I'm a linguist and I like to sometimes turn to words to help understand these really profound concepts that we encounter in Asian traditions, in Hinduism, Buddhism, our the non-Western wisdoms. So there's a word that we find in Sanskrit that means non-dual wisdom or non-dual awareness, and that word is Advaya Jnana. And Advaya actually means not two. So non-dual, literally in the Sanskrit, is not two. And what is the two? And the two, most of the time, it means the subject, the perceiver, and the world, the object, so to speak. All of those things that we perceive. So to say not two means a type of wisdom or a type of perception or a type of awareness that is beyond the notion of someone perceiving and a world that is perceived. So this non-dual means this ability in ourselves, which is innate, to perforate through the sense of separateness that seems to follow us everywhere, that there's an I, and then there's the other, or there's an I, and then there's the world. And we think that is true, quote unquote. But actually, we are so interconnected and interdependent. If you were a physicist, you would say that's actually not true. You can't tell where a human being ends and the next molecule begins. They are all molecules that are communicating and in relationship. That's more true than what we think, the sense of separateness. So what non-dual wisdom, that word is pointing us to at Vajrayana, is the fact that we can experience that as a quality of consciousness, that we have an awareness that is capable of dissolving the sense of separateness. And how do we do that? How do we dissolve a sense of separateness? Well, actually, I think we've all experienced non-duality. It's not like this thing out there in the future that we're going to experience one day, although it is the end of the spiritual path, the end of a contemplative path, the end of the meditative path. We could say the fruition is non-duality, but we've experienced it already because it's innate to us. To give you an example, when we're out in nature, that's where I experience it a lot. There's this sense of a falling away of boundaries, and we feel one with everything. I think most of us have had some taste of that, maybe on a beach, gazing at the ocean, or on a mountaintop, looking at the view below. There are these moments that we have when we forget that I'm here, that I'm a self. We are like just beyond that sense of separateness. I do think that everyone has had those experiences. We could say experiences of non-dual wisdom or non-duality. In the somatic teachings, which are teachings on the body in Buddhism and Hinduism, there's also a somatic dimension of non-duality, which means the non-duality of body and mind. So that's another way that we can become dualistic, is thinking that somehow the mind is truly and ultimately separate from the body, when really these two things have been primordially integrated. And these days, neuroscientists say that is the truth, that if we want to say it from the perspective of brain body, the brain extends all over the body in the form of a nervous system. It used to be in neuroscience that they talked about the study of the brain as something from the neck up. But now in modern neuroscience, they recognize that's not true. The brain is actually going all the way down the spine and extending out to the ends of the pores. And in the same way, our mind and our body are integrated, primordially connected. So there's a possibility of experiencing a somatic non-duality too. And I think we do, when we practice spirituality, experience that through practice, through yoga, through maybe your spiritual practice is rock climbing, or maybe it's kayaking. In those physical kinds of experiences, sometimes we have this melting away of the separateness between the mind and the body, and we're just in flow. And that's a non-dual experience, a somatic non-dual experience.
This is going to sound like a strange example of this. I promise it's related. One of the reasons I'm a licensed skydiver, used to jump a lot more when I was younger, before I had kids. And one of the reasons why I like it so much is exactly what you mentioned. When you are moving toward the door of a moving aircraft at altitude and you exit, it's 100% a connected sensory experience. There's next to no sense of I or separateness or chatter or anything. You're completely in the moment and experiential, and so connected to the air that you're using to move yourself around and hold yourself steady. It's just this interesting experience. So if you've ever been in an experience where it's so immersive, you lose that sense of self, and it's wonderful. It is a wonderful break from the way that we typically walk around and experience life.
I am so glad you brought that one up, April, as an example. And yes, and for me, it's rock climbing is like that, because you can't really be anywhere but in the moment when you're rock climbing. If you exit the moment, you fall. So yes, you have to be really present, and just even to do it, to catch the next handhold. And in a moment of distraction, that is when you fall. So that same kind of, there's something about the body in this slightly edgy space, when your senses are completely alive, that you lose self. You're like, you don't have a sense of self. It's just flow. You and the elements, and those two things feeling unified. And that is this somatic experience of non-duality. I consider that to be meditation, that is meditation in motion. This idea that meditation happens on a cushion, and when we're still only, I think is not the case. That when we're still and on the cushion, that is an important discipline. It's something I've practiced my whole life. But the more you practice meditation, the more you realize it isn't a practice, it's a state of being that gets you to what you're describing, April, when you're skydiving experience.
Yeah, I love that. And there's an important connection that I think we can make here, in that typically, without this type of practice, without this more contemplative practice, mindfulness practice, any of these things that we're talking about, our typical experience of our own mind, our typical experience as people moving through life and the context that we're in, is not one like we've talked about. Can you talk a little bit about, because this can create some pushback on this topic of non-duality, because it runs counter to the way that we typically would experience our own minds.
Yeah, great point, April. Yeah, this is not our day-to-day. This idea of a non-dual experience may not seem like our day-to-day. So my answer to that would be, there's many things we haven't experienced. And so one, actually, this is something that came from one of my own teachers. My Tibetan is a Tibetan, ancient kind of wizened Tibetan yogi back in the 80s. And one of the things that he used to say, which helped me a lot as a beginner, because I didn't have a sense of what is this non-dual experience. I was drawn to it, interested in it, curious. But he said, if you haven't been to Paris before, and people are talking to you about Paris, it doesn't mean that Paris doesn't exist. It means that you haven't been there yet. And so if you want to actually, and this is true really with all, I think all the contemplative path in general, you should never take things because someone else says they exist. Actually, that if you want to know whether non-duality exists, take a few steps down a contemplative path and try some techniques and see if it opens up a world to you that you have not experienced yet. And if you can see yourself that far ahead to do that, then you can actually experience non-duality. And I think non-duality is an experience, and it's not something that can be even put into words. So I think I would just say that yes, you should be skeptical, and we should all be skeptical. And yes, it doesn't mean that it isn't there and that we wouldn't enjoy it. So I think it's one of those test to see if it's true kind of things.
Love it. I love it. I want to switch gears a little bit because there's another practice, concept, notion that I think is very helpful for people to keep in mind. You know, a lot of your teachings also, they include this notion of impermanence. How do you use the topic of impermanence, the notion of impermanence in your teachings, and how does that help people?
Yeah. You know, when we hear a word like impermanence, it immediately invokes the sense of, for many of us, the sense of loss, that things change and we lose. But actually, when we really look at it, if things didn't change, nothing could be born. Nothing new could come about. So impermanence is just as much about birth as it is about the passing of something and making room for something new to arise. And I think that, so in my practice of meditation, one of the primary reflections that I do is an intentional reflection on impermanence, because reflecting on impermanence is not pessimistic, it's realistic. Things don't last, right? We can look at anything around me, see even in this room, these curtains, this shrine, the mic that I'm speaking into, none of that is going to last forever. And so in the reflection on impermanence, we start to see that as true in the present, that these things that we think of as being so solid and real will one day change. And there's a kind of freedom in that. When we reflect on it, when I reflect on that, prior to the loss, prior to the dissolution of that thing which I think is really going to be there forever, it actually prepares me to let go. And allows me to let go right now, even before it's disappeared and transitioned into some new form and become something else, or made room for something else to arise, that I've already prepared myself that is going to happen. And that's not a bad thing. That's a natural thing. And that's okay. And so for me, the reflection on impermanence has been very much about freedom, about allowing myself to free up the grasping that I have right now to whatever it is, so that when it does pass, I can see that as a natural phenomena and an evolution rather than a loss.
That's so good. And it is very realistic. You can't think of anything in life that won't change or go away or become born again. There isn't anything that is permanent. I want to tie this back to a couple of things that we've talked about already, but the topic of impermanence, or using impermanence in your practice. You know, I'm a parent. I'm a mom of two very young children, and those days are taxing some days. And I've found that in the most challenging times, the practice of reminding myself of the impermanence of it can change that situation from one of struggle to one of gratitude, particularly around my kids. When I remember, there will be a time when I don't tuck my kids in anymore. And even though I want time to myself in the evenings, there will be a last time. It makes me choke up thinking about it, where I'll tuck them in and that'll be it. And it makes me like I tear up, and that emotion happens because you find that it's something that is deeply important to me, even though in that moment we can get caught up in the work of it all and in the overwhelm of it all. It helps me shift and become more mindful if I contemplate that and pepper my life with that type of contemplation.
Yeah, that's so well put, April. Yeah. And when we're having a really hard time, the reflection on impermanence can be so helpful. Like with COVID this last year, for me, the reflection on permanence was a constant mantra. This too shall pass. It feels like it's never going to end. It's extended so far beyond where we expected it to go. We've all been under the COVID umbrella for so much longer than we expected, but that is not forever either. So that mantra, this too shall pass, makes something that seems so unbearable much more bearable. And knowing that is absolutely going to, if there's one thing we can rely on, it's that this too shall pass. We may not be able to rely on much else, but that we can.
That's so good.
Yeah.
As we're wrapping up our conversation today, folks have come to this summit to make this the best year of their lives. The practices that we've talked about certainly can help in that regard. What are your, tips or final things for people who are getting started on this type of spiritual or contemplative practice? What are the things that you want people to take away as they begin to incorporate this into the work that they're doing in the summit to improve their lives?
Well, I would say that for me, the juice of the spiritual path has been about finding your purpose. And that by becoming intimate with yourself and your own mind, your own consciousness, your own body, which is the sense of spiritual path, is becoming intimate. When you become intimate with that, you find your purpose. And that makes life both meaningful and joyful. So I would say that if you are wondering if you might want to take up a spiritual practice, take up a practice of mindfulness or meditation, take up something of that nature, that's what you have down the road, is to find your purpose or to join it with your purpose. So that's something to really be excited about.
I love that so much. Willa, this is so great. It was so nice to have you here. These topics that we've covered are so meaningful and important and can really lead to such a shift in people's lives. And I appreciate you being here and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you so much, April. It's been so great to meet you, and thanks for inviting me to be a part.